So again, welcome. My name is Rich Fernandez. I'm the CEO of the SIY Leadership Institute. You may be familiar with us, maybe not. We originally started at Google as a mindfulness and emotional intelligence platform to help employees there with sustainable high performance, resilience, mindfulness, and emotional intelligence. We subsequently spun off the Institute as a separate nonprofit entity. We exist today as a nonprofit educational institute, really training leaders and organizations around the world and the public at large on the skills of emotional intelligence, mindfulness, and resilience. I am so thrilled you're joining us today, and I'm so thrilled for our special guest, Dr. Amishi Jha. I'm going to give you a very brief intro. First of all, I need to say that we are especially pleased and blessed because Dr. Jha is part of our board of directors over the last year, bringing this incredible expertise around the science of mindfulness and attention, and emotional intelligence, and resilience, a particular expertise to our organization that we are happy to share with everyone now. And so let me just introduce Dr. Jha, and we'll go straight into it. So Dr. Jha is an associate professor at the University of Miami in the Department of Psychology. She runs the Jha Lab, and she's also the director of the Contemplative Neuroscience, Mindfulness Research and Practice Initiative at the University of Miami. Formerly, she was an assistant professor of cognitive neuroscience at University of Pennsylvania. And over the past 2+ decades, Dr. Jha has published extensively in many top research publications, literally dozens of scholarly works on the topics of attention, working memory, executive function. And she also specializes in applications of mental training and mindfulness towards executive functioning, cognition, emotion, resilience, and attention. So she works extensively in educational settings, corporate settings, with elite sports athletes, with first responders, and in military contexts. And she has been featured at TED. She has been featured in National Public Radio here in the United States, Mindful Magazine, and she's presented at the World Economic Forum, NATO, the Pentagon, and the UK Parliament. So just an incredible world-leading expert in this field of attention and mindfulness. We're so pleased to have you here. With that, I think I'll just invite you, Amishi, to see if there's anything you want to just open with here with the group.
Sure, happy to. It's great to be here. I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled to be part of the board of this organization, and really happy to have this conversation. It's incredible that we're seeing people from all over the world here. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. I thought it might be helpful as we start out to give, well, thank you for that introduction. And now I'm blushing, you can't tell, but really what I think would be probably good to describe for folks that don't know really any details about my work is sort of the perspective I take in the research that we conduct. And as you already said, I'm a scientist, I'm a neuroscientist, and in particular, I study how the human brain pays attention. That's sort of the anchoring topic of all the work in my lab at the University of Miami. And in doing so, we use a whole bunch of different kinds of techniques. We're very fortunate to have lots of tools to be able to do this: functional MRI, brainwave recording, behavioral tasks, self-report instruments, the whole gamut. And what we learned from all of this work is that, of course, the attention system is so powerful. I think what we'll get into, I hope, in our conversation is feeling that its power may not be quite as strong during certain kind of uncertain and high stress moments, but it's a very powerful brain system. Sometimes we refer to it as the brain's boss, because it ends up that wherever we direct our attention, the whole rest of the brain sort of reconfigures its processing in support of what we pay attention to. But after studying that sort of aspect of attention, just sort of the basics of how it works, one thing kept coming up over and over again, for me at least, which was that, yeah, it's very powerful, and we have a good sense of how it might work. Of course, there's always more work to be done, but it's also vulnerable and fragile. And there are things that end up being kind of like kryptonite for the attention system, so that it's disabled and degrades its functioning. And there were sort of three that kept popping up over and over again. These are threat, poor mood, and stress. And as you mentioned, some of the populations that we work with, these are not threat, poor mood, and stress are not just sort of the annoyances of being human. We all experience that. But for some professions, these sort of describe the circumstances that require them to show up and engage in their professional life. So first responders or military service members would be examples of that. And so I became very curious about ways we might be able to train the brain, train attention to strengthen it, so that in the face of all of those sort of degrading and debilitating influences, it can still work well. And that's how essentially the work on mindfulness entered my lab, as a training, as a brain training tool.
Fascinating. Yeah. And it's such a timely area of study right now. And that's actually the topic of today, which I think I failed to mention that, which is the neuroscience of staying calm and focused in the midst of chaos. Which is very much what we're experiencing now. And for the participants that have joined, just the other thing of housekeeping before we really dive into the very things that Dr. Jha was talking about, we will go for about 15 minutes here, and then we're going to pause and take questions. And the way you can send in questions is through the chat feature. Right now, the chat feature is turned off because, to the point of attention, we just want to keep and direct our attention, to the topic. We'll turn on the chat feature for us to all see, and then we'll kind of curate some questions. About 15 minutes in, we'll again share, Dr. Jha will share other concepts and ideas, and then we'll have another 15 minutes or so at the end. So we'll have 2 Q&A periods and using the chat feature, and we'll let you know when that's on. There is a staff member, a team member here at the SIY Institute, Regina Zazinski, who's, there's Regina, and she's helping us curate the chat feature and the questions. So we will definitely do our best to get to them. We have close to 500 participants at the moment. So again, we'll do our best to kind of curate really salient questions. But let's turn back now to this topic and invite Dr. Jha to share more. And you really said something important here on this topic of staying focused and calm in the midst of chaos, and that we get pulled away from being focused and staying calm under these conditions of threat, of stress, and a poor mood. So can you give us a little bit of a sense of how that is really happening for us all now? I think this is one of those moments where globally, so many of us are experiencing similar things. So what's your perspective on how this is affecting us now, from a neuroscience perspective, especially?
Yeah, I mean, that's the first thing to say, is that this is a globally shared experience. And if anybody listening is having that sense of sort of fog or feeling unable to kind of get that sharp, crisp thinking that you're used to being able to get at least every now and then, you're not alone is the first thing to say. And also that it's a very real thing that we're experiencing. And I think one maybe way to start talking about this is to unpack what this system of attention actually is, because I talk about it as if it's one thing, but it's actually many, many things. And I think that might be a good way for us to start getting a window into what it is that goes wrong when we are under these sort of extraordinary circumstances of global and sustained feeling of discomfort and uncertainty. So as I said, it's a big function, this brain system of attention. And actually, if you think about it historically or even evolutionarily, why do we have an attention system? And it goes back to the idea that the brain suffered from kind of a big problem, which was that there's much more out there in the world. There's far too much information available in the world than it could possibly fully process. So over the course of evolution, the solution that came about through natural selection was attention. And what attention most broadly allows us to do is to take of all the information available, a subset that we can really focus in on and fully actually get information regarding. So in order to do that, it actually is broken down into kind of 3 main systems. And I'll try to make this sort of as accessible as possible. Just, first of all, I have no slides, so there's nothing to point to. You just have to hear my voice and try to understand what I'm saying. But I think that one kind of helpful way to do this is through metaphors. So I'll use various metaphors to kind of anchor our discussion on attention. And one very common way to think about attention is probably what most of us think of when I say that word, is this focusing capacity, to narrow and devote our cognitive energy in a limited way, right? That is something we call the brain's orienting system. And a metaphor I like to use for the orienting system is like a flashlight, or in other parts of the world, we sometimes call it a torch. Just this thing that if you're in a darkened room, you turn on your torch or flashlight, and wherever it is that you point, you're going to have privileged access to that information. Or if you're walking along a dark path, the flashlight will guide you so that you can know exactly the terrain. And attention, at least the attention orienting system, is very similar. So that wherever it is that you direct that brain system, you have more information. And that flashlight of attention can be directed toward the external environment, like just like an actual flashlight. But what's really interesting about this system is you can direct it internally as well. And so, that might sound strange, but if I ask you right now, what did you have to eat for your last meal?
Yeah.
I think everybody can kind of instantly, hopefully, who knows, with the haze that we're all experiencing right now, but you could most of the time reflect on what that was and easily bring it back, right? So what happened in that moment when I asked that question? Essentially, that flashlight of attention allowed you to probe your memory, and you could bring it up and then look to see what the information was, a sandwich or something like that. So that's a very powerful brain system. We use it for our emotions. We use it to plan, to organize, to decide, a whole bunch of things. But there's very different ways that attention can work relative to this sort of narrowing and flashlight view. And I want to just describe another way to think about attention. But Rich, did you want to say something before I go into that next system?
Well, as regards attention, one thing I wonder, and maybe we can answer, I don't know if now or later, but right now, given the overwhelm and the chaos that we're all experiencing, how does that affect this attentional system? How does this affect the spotlight of our attention, our capacity to harness and direct that kind of, that torchlight of our attention?
Yeah, and we'll definitely, I can talk more about that, but I'll just give the short answer now, which is that usually we know where we're directing it. We willfully can point it. But oftentimes the context makes that capacity more challenged. And one aspect of what happens under stress is that the flashlight in some sense gets stuck. It gets stuck on depressogenic, anxiety-provoking, worry-building, fear-inducing concepts. And then you're no longer free to move it where you will. It's just locked in there.
Yeah.
And it's actually that aspect of attention getting disabled that is resulting in a lot of psychological disorders, including depression. We see in some ways depression as a disorder of attention, when depressogenic content is sort of where we stay hyper-focused.
Yeah.
So that's just giving you a sense of, and I think we can talk about how all of these systems that I'll describe are vulnerable in some way under these circumstances. But at least that gives you a clue, at least for the orienting system, why it ends up that we may ruminate or get stuck in these loops of worry, because frankly, our attention system isn't helping us out. It's just pointing there over and over again.
That's really helpful.
Separate from that system is the exact opposite type of attention system, which is where we really don't select information. And that may be kind of strange to think about, because I just was saying how attention is about selecting. But think about the last time you were driving down the road or walking down the street and you saw a flashing yellow traffic light. I think anywhere in the world people have experienced this at some point. Typically what that means is it's like a warning, right? It's not a flashing yellow, not going from like red to yellow to green, just it's flashing. It usually is indicating for some reason you better watch out for what's going on in this particular intersection. Maybe it's a strange traffic pattern or children running. That essentially is a good metaphor for this other brain system called the alerting system. And unlike the narrowing of the flashlight, this is the broadening, this kind of surveilling mode where you're just going to be ready. You don't know what's coming, but you need to be ready so that if anything does, you can deploy attention and take action as needed. And this is another sort of very important capacity that we have. We use this all the time, and we kind of go back and forth in using these systems depending on the needs of the moment. And just like we were talking about a moment ago, how stress and uncertainty can lock in that orienting system or make the flashlight point too rigidly at a particular location. Sometimes under stressful circumstances, and I would agree with what you started out saying, that that's what we're kind of in right now, is this global moment of collective stress and uncertainty. What happens to the alerting system is that it becomes overly active. And now everything is seen as a potential threat or flashing yellow light. And this leads to states like hypervigilance and hyperarousal and anxiety. So we have to be aware of that also, is that system going into overdrive can produce kind of an overactivation of always being on alert. which is also not good and leads to a lot of suffering on our own part.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of helps make the distinction. There's only one other thing I wanted to mention just about how attention works, which I hope can be beneficial. And the metaphor I like to use for this system is the juggler. So this is something where you really are trying to keep all the balls in the air. And this is a term, and I think related to SIY's work, it's very relevant. This is the executive system of attention. And it's literally using the term executive to reflect sort of like the executive of a company. The job of the executive is not to do all the individual tasks that the rest of the team might have to do, but to oversee what's happening to ensure that our goals and our behavior align. And very different than focusing or broadening, right? It's sort of this management kind of system that we need to have, which is so important and needed for us to, frankly, do anything. The coordination of all three of these is necessary for everything. But again, just like the problems that we see with disabling of attention in those other two arenas, if we have a poor juggler, the balls will drop. And again, I feel that often these days is that it sort of feels like I have the intention of getting that accomplished, but it's very difficult to muster the cognitive momentum to sometimes do it.
Yeah, fascinating. So all three systems are affected by this kind of chaotic, overwhelming moment, is one thing I was hearing. So how can we start to fix that? How do we address that?
Yeah. I mean, I actually think it's non-trivial to just begin by acknowledging that that's real, that it's really happening to us, and it hopefully give us a little bit of patience with ourselves that, you know, it can happen as a function of the circumstances that we're in, and not to sort of force ourselves to overwork these systems when they're already sort of more fragile and vulnerable. I think that's a very important first lesson. But, you know, the whole thing that I started out saying was that, you know, we saw this over and over again in certain populations. So service members, soldiers, for example, or even emergency services individuals like firefighters, when they go through a training period, not even the actual fire, the actual war itself, but just preparing to do that, all of these systems tend to get degraded and diminish in their functioning. And so the question is, what can you do about it? Well, I think if we think about what is driving this attention to kind of go haywire, what is actually happening that is making us experience the degradation of attention? And I think it's because of this very wonderful capacity that the mind has, but unfortunately gets used in the wrong circumstances right now, which is the capacity to mental time traveling. So, you know, we always think, oh, will we ever be able to mentally time travel? We do it all the time. We do it seamlessly, right? We can rewind the mind to the past, think about how things were maybe 4 months ago when you could just go outside your door and walk around, or we fast forward to think about what we want to do in the future. And this capacity is so needed for everything in our lives. But when we experience stress, that capacity can hijack attention so that it's no longer functioning properly. In fact, it can hijack it so that when you are rewinding the mind, you're actually stuck in these ruminative loops, not just reflecting on what's happened before, but stuck there in a problematic way. And probably more the case now, when we experience stress, attention can be in fast forward constantly. So you're thinking about the uncertainty, you're thinking about the potential fear and risk involved in anything that might happen. And these are real things. I'm not trying to say that these are not real things. But we have to notice that it's really taking us away from the present moment. So to your question about what to do about it, it would be wonderful if we could somehow figure out how to train the mind to sort of be in the present moment, or keep that button on play. And if we think of like an MP3 player, rewinding and fast forwarding. And that I wish was as easy as just wishing that we can stay in the moment, reminding ourselves, okay, just be in the here and now, you know, because that's more of a constrained set of circumstances. But the mind's not that cooperative. And it ends up half of our waking moments are spent with our mind in fast forward or rewind. Under stress, that number goes up to even a higher percentage. So this is where mindfulness training actually has a big role to play, where we're trying to train the mind. We're actually giving the brain exercises, a suite of exercises that will allow us to get better practice at keeping the button on play willfully, because we've strengthened the capacity to do so.
Yeah. In a moment, I'll open it up for questions. I guess the last thing I would then ask is, how do we know when we're pulled away? How do we know when we're kind of going down the rabbit hole, as they say, or this kind of pathway of just getting stuck? How do we know that within ourselves?
Right. I mean, I think that we know it. There are times when we'll catch ourselves, right? When it could be something salient, like you're in the middle of trying to draft an email or read a page in a book, and you notice you gotten to the bottom of the page having no idea what happened, right? And so we do have this very potent capacity to notice where our mind is. We can tap in any moment to doing that. But most of us aren't doing that as often as we probably should be, to catch ourselves, to ensure that we don't overprivilege the past or the future. And this, thankfully, is something that mindfulness training also helps cultivate, the capacity to know where the mind is. Because without that, you can never catch mind wandering. You wouldn't know. It's kind of interesting. I teach an undergrad course at the University of Miami. And at the beginning of the semester, I asked them, how much do you think your mind wanders? And most of them would say, oh, no, I'm pretty focused. My mind does not wander very much at all. As we start doing mindfulness practices in class, sort of by the middle of the semester, they'll say, oh my gosh, I was so foolish to think my mind didn't wander. My mind wanders so much. And, I think it's not the case that they just mind wander more as the middle of the semester, but this capacity to understand what's happening moment to moment in our conscious experience kind of empowers us to see what's going on and how we are, in our attention systems, actively playing a role in our perception and our actions.
And especially because our minds wander by default. I mean, right? It's sort of a natural normative thing for anyone to experience, is very significant amount of mind wandering.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, we can talk about this, but I think that we don't want to stop our mind from wandering. There are many ways in which this is such a valuable, important, natural part of the way the brain functions. But particularly now under high stress, and when we're trying to get something done, there is a task at hand. It's problematic when the mind just goes off in any direction, is unaware of where it is in any moment.
Okay, good. That's a good place we could explore further, but I'm going to ask us to pause for a moment. We're about 15 minutes in, and I want to for sure make room for questions that may be coming. So our team member Regina is on and is looking at the chat feature and is turning that on now, so we could see a few of the chats, see some of the questions coming in. And we'll also select a few of these. We'll try to get to what we can. There's a lot of us on this call, but what questions are really popping up for you, anyone, and just send that over via chat.
Thanks, Rich. And so our first question is from Natalia, who says, what type of practice or meditation is more efficient to train attention according to your research?
Right. That's a great question. Rich, do you want me to
yes,
take
please.
that one right now?
Please,
okay,
please.
Great. I think that the short answer is that we haven't actually parsed the whole suite of practices we give people, but I think it's important to describe sort of big categories and the benefits that they have. So typically in our mindfulness training programs, there's kind of two categories of practices. One category we call the focused attention practices. So these are things like mindfulness of breathing, and the body scan would be an example of that, where there is sort of a target object, if you will. And our job is to make our attention, let's just talk about a mindfulness of breathing exercise, maybe to be very clear. So in a typical mindfulness of breath or mindfulness of breathing exercise, our instruction would be to pay attention to the sensations of our breath, maintain our attention there for the period of time we're practicing. When we notice that our mind has wandered, which it will, we just redirect back. And so the kind of core components of attention that we would say are being exercised there is this ability to focus or narrow, direct that flashlight, to maintain focus, right, which is a working memory, another system, and then to notice what's going on and then exercise that capacity to move the flashlight back. And when we give people exercises like that, we do find that the orienting system is stronger, as well as the ability to sustain attention is also improved. Same thing goes for the body scan. In many ways, it's sort of like taking the flashlight of attention and guiding it willfully throughout the body in a directed sort of part by part way. These focused attention practices are sort of one category, and then the other category would be what we'd call open monitoring practices. And they really tap into that sort of alerting system or surveilling system. And the instruction there would be, keeping attention sort of steady and stable we're going to allow sight, sounds, thoughts, memories, emotions arise and then pass away. Sort of like clouds passing in the sky. And when people engage in those types of practices, we similarly see that the alerting system is stronger. They're better able to stay in this sort of surveilling mode without being overly reactive to it, but just in a stable manner, allow the arising and falling away of experiences. So I would say the core suite that includes things like focused attention, body scan, and open monitoring practices tend to be a good sort of cross-training for our attention in many ways.
Great, thank you so much. I actually saw a couple of questions come through that I thought were pretty compelling. Here's a really interesting question from Christina Lopez. What if the present moment is where you don't want to be because of the circumstances you're living? And I think that's especially relevant now with COVID. Like, this is a really tough time for anyone to be alive in some ways. So what about that?
Right. So, I think it all depends on our orientation to the present moment. And we get this question a lot, even with service members who want to say, well, I want to distract myself out of this situation. And I appreciate that. I mean, there's a lot of difficulty and challenge with what we are experiencing. But I think part of what mindfulness practice in particular allows us to do in some sense is cultivate this capacity to have what I'd call distress tolerance. And developing this orientation that it's not our experience or our intention is not to feel good about every moment that occurs. But frankly, it's only this present moment that we can live in. And there's a whole bunch of things happening in addition, meaning there are stories overlaid upon the direct experience of what we're having right now. And so part of what we want to cultivate through practices like the ones I was just describing a moment ago is a kind of mental toughness to not push away, and to not overly elaborate, but to be with the experiences that arise. And with that capacity, in some sense, you become better able to maneuver through difficulty, because whether we like it or not, we are experiencing difficulty. There are challenges. Disregarding the reality of that is not really going to help us, especially not take care of ourselves as we are globally suffering through. So I wish we could push it away and it would be fine, but unfortunately, typically it's not the case. So we want to cultivate this capacity to be with or befriend our experience. And I think these practices help with that.
Yeah, in fact, a lot of your research is with folks who are in very high stress environments, whether, military service members or first responders. Are you seeing outcomes that suggest that through these types of mental training and mental practice, mindfulness, that they actually can navigate those situations more effectively? That's because it's sort of like an analogy to our current circumstance. I mean, we're not running into burning buildings as firefighters might, but it seems like the world's a little bit on fire around us, to use the metaphor. So can this training help? Have you seen that actually with people in these high stress environments?
Well, that's essentially what they report, is that instead of being blind or on autopilot with regard to what they're experiencing, their eyes are open, so to speak. And probably one of the more compelling cases stories, testimony came from a Marine who was a medic who had been deployed 5 or 6 times before he was in our study. And he described just that feeling of being in a complete haze and almost bloodthirsty, that he'd been there so many times, kind of knew the drill, was not really paying attention to what was happening. And having gone through the program, the mindfulness training program, and then being deployed again, he noticed a categorical shift that allowed for more direct connection to what was happening around him. I mean, even things that just spontaneously emerged that were more of a compassionate orientation. Seeing a child on the street and thinking, that could be my son. Just a very connected, direct way of dealing with what's going on that actually he felt empowered him to do his job better, because he had more access to information to maneuver through difficult situations instead of closing off and being blind to what's happening. And I think that's true for us too. We may want to just bury our heads in the sand, but the reality is we have to figure out how to keep going. We're going to have to, figure out how to deal with social distancing, wearing masks, being safe, taking care of each other, dealing with the world functioning with this very real and ongoing threat. And we kind of need our full attention to be able to do that well. We can't we can't be on autopilot.
Yeah. And so we can do this, in other words, because there's one question from our participant named Jack Curley who says, how can we train mindfulness and be sensitive to how afraid a lot of people are? And I'm just wondering, are those two different things, right? We are afraid, and is it possible to exercise these capacities for attention and mindfulness in this state of being afraid?
Being afraid? Is that
afraid, F-R-A-Y-E.
Afraid, being afraid.
Like straining.
Right. So that's the sort of good news of this whole thing, is that it's not too late. I mean, if it were too late, I think I wouldn't probably be talking to you, because there'd be no hope for us. We're all just stuck with our brains being hijacked away. But the very, I think, empowering piece of news is that, yes, we can train our attention. As I was saying before, whether it's, any of these groups that we work with, soldiers, students, firefighters, business executives, all of them, we usually meet them at a moment where they are more likely to have challenge. And we know that over some 4 to 6 to 8 week period, their mood and stress levels, their mood's going to decline and their stress levels are going to go up. And even within these periods of time, when we offer the mindfulness training program, asking them to do as little as 12 minutes a day, we can stabilize those functions and stabilize attention. So that actually, whereas those that don't get the training decline, as we would have predicted, those that actually start practicing can stay stable over time. And the cool part is, it very much is like physical activity. The more you do, if you do more than 12 minutes, the more you benefit. So that there were some individuals in these prior studies where they were kind of going for it, right? We asked them to do 30 minutes a day. Most people didn't, but some did. And for those individuals, they actually got better than where they started, which was to us very surprising that was even possible. So yeah, going back to the kind of example of this, we had, when we first did our very first project with Marines, actually, we trained them in the pre-deployment interval. And there were a group of them that fully resisted us. They thought we were just full of it. They didn't want anything to do with our study. They were just there because they were asked to be there. They spent their time there, ignored us completely. Then they were deployed. And what we noticed when we tested them in our laboratory measures is, yeah, as we expected, over pre-deployment, their attention got worse and their mood got worse, unlike the guys that actually practiced. But then we had an opportunity to test them again when they came back from deployment. And what I noticed is that a small group of them actually got better than before they left. And I was like, how is this possible? How do you get dropped into a war zone, you're in the middle of combat, and your attention improves? Not all these elaborate theories about, well, maybe they felt activated by the purpose of their mission. I was completely wrong. It ended up that they actually contacted our trainer while they were in Iraq and said, look, my buddy who didn't ignore you, who actually paid attention, he's not staying awake all night. He isn't just getting the shakes every minute. He's actually functioning very well. Can you start teaching me that stuff that I didn't do before? And they learned actually in the middle of combat. And to me, that really is motivating, that even if it feels challenging, even if it feels frayed, if we devote a small period of time to the exercise of showing up to what is actually occurring for us in this moment, it can start strengthening these capacities for us. And I think that can go a long way to helping us actually feel better.
Thank you. That's really informative. And there's an interesting follow-up question that I'll link it to from Jennifer Feldman, one of our participants. Can you meditate too much? Are there sort of negative side effects to exercising this capacity?
That's a good one. I mean, I would say there's always possibilities that things could go wrong. But I mean, typically when it's done in the care of a teacher in a community, the chances are less because people are kind of watching out for each other. I think a lot of times when people are experiencing sort of difficult emotions, it's difficult to know whether these are just the reality of what's happening and we're becoming more intimately familiar with it. Sort of like my students were saying, my mind's all over the place, where they didn't have that realization before. So it's very difficult to know what might be driving this sense of, I feel worse. And I think part of it involves kind of normalizing the expectation of what will happen if you start practicing mindfulness. And this, I think, is a very, very important topic. Often, and I would say probably every interview I'm asked to do, except for this one where we're having a deeper dive into the conversation, the question is, how do I feel better? How do I get my bliss? How do I maximize my joy? And make sure mindfulness gets me there. And I think that that is the wrong expectation of what these practices will help cultivate. So if going in, you think I'm just going to feel better, instead of I may change my relationship to my circumstances so I'm more empowered to take action on behalf of myself in a way that's more healthful. You may end up thinking that it was a failed experience and that you actually feel worse. So I think it's a complex question and one I would take very seriously. But to encourage people, if they do feel that it's difficult, to ensure that you're talking to a teacher or a community or a therapist, somebody that can actually guide you for your specific circumstances, and to be very clear on what the expectations are going in, so that if they're not met, you're not horribly disappointed.
Yeah, and then what about, like, today we have apps, of course, and to what extent are these other tools, things that you can do from your phone, for example, like an app, from your perspective, how useful is that? Are they having this kind of positive effect in a similar way that a teacher, really credible, experienced teacher, or practicing in the context of a community might have? What's your perspective on those?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the real question. So the good news is that we have a lot of options now, more than we've ever had in the mindfulness space, right? So that's good news. And it's also kind of a cautionary tale of buyer beware. The first thing I'll say is downloading an app and putting it on your phone is not going to make you more mindful. You actually have to open it up and do something. That's the first thing, which I know is obvious. But and then I would say that there is growing support by small but serious number of studies done in a very good, solid way, randomized controlled trials with active controls and double-blind conditions, et cetera. We're seeing that there are benefits of apps. But we don't really know what the saturation point is. So meaning you might get better in your own self-reported mood, and you might feel that you're able to have more moments of calm, or your experience of stress is less. And that's all great. But how is that able to be maintained, just in terms of your engagement in it? And also, how does it compare to having a teacher where you can work through some of the trouble spots that you might run into? That's actually the study that we're doing it right now. We're proposing to do that right now, where we can compare head to head what happens when you've got a trainer versus an app alone, and see what happens in terms of the sustained benefits we might experience, not just in the self-report stuff, but actually in the objective measures and the brain changes that might come with training our mind in this way.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I really look forward to seeing the outcomes of that study. I want to go back to a question actually that was further up in the thread from Jose Ramos, which is that the question is really, when is mindfulness practice not enough? By this I mean, and this is Jose saying this, by this I mean that it seems like there are times when there is an actual underlying medical condition that needs to be treated versus a healthy state that allows you to practice so that you can engage in prevention and other healthy benefits.
Right. Great question. Mindfulness is not a cure-all. Mindfulness is not a therapeutic tool unless there are aspects of mindfulness practices that are blended and curated for a particular therapeutic context. So for example, something like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression has not only the mindfulness components in it, but real cognitive therapy components. And typically it's offered by a skilled clinician so that you can kind of maneuver through the landscape of the complexity of those situations with care. And so I definitely think this is very important. And by the way, it's not one size fits all. So mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression may be very different than using those kind of tools in the context of binge eating disorder or anxiety or PTSD. And there are certainly circumstances and conditions for which mindfulness training is contraindicated. You should probably not do it. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, is that in a world where mindfulness is really seen, which is so shocking to me. When I began this research, 15, 20 years ago, people thought nobody would care about mindfulness. So now we're in this point where, in fact, so many people care about it and it's seen as so powerful that there's almost this sort of other point of view, which is, oh, maybe it's not good for everything. And it's not a one size fits all. Okay. So I think that it's important to take that into consideration, and that everything should be done, especially with regard to psychological illness, with under the supervision of a really skilled clinician.
Yeah, so I've been kind of continuing with some follow-ups to that. And this is really great. I think we'll just keep going with the questions because they're really quite profound and very
I'm
useful.
happy to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're good with that. Yeah, great. So I guess one thing is, how do we know what makes a good trainer? Like what do you look for? The question is from Nicole Brooks. The question is, can you speak more to the kinds of trainers that you're describing?
Yeah. Again, I love these questions because this is exactly the kind of questions we ask in our research studies. And one of the challenges for us when we've done all of this work, when we get beneficial effects, is the sort of scalability challenge. So for example, if you did mindfulness training in this elite group we did a project with special forces and we found beneficial effects. And, then the question is, well, how many trainers do you have? And my answer was 1. So the question of training competencies, trainer sort of practicum to get people trained up, these are real considerations. And I think that a lot of good work is being done in the context of clinical programs for mindfulness training that we can use as guides of how we might do this. I'll say that in our work, which is not clinical, it's really a psychoeducation tool for people that are psychologically healthy. The kinds of questions we've been asking about trainers is, what matters more? Is it their expertise in mindfulness, or is it their familiarity about a particular context? Right? So one study we published recently looked at a certified mindfulness-based stress reduction trainer, excellent, skilled mindfulness trainer, 25 years of experience, ran many MBSR courses. We compared that kind of that trainer, to people that had never, ever trained anybody else in mindfulness and didn't even really practice it before we began. And so what we did is we trained up both of these sort of categories of trainers, and both were asked to then deliver the same training program, to active duty soldiers. So this other category of trainer were sports psychologists who had already been training soldiers. So they knew a lot about this context of what the soldiers' challenges are, how to motivate them, what matters to them. We were able to, over a 10-week, well, actually in this case, it was a 12-week period of time, not only have them learn about mindfulness for themselves before even talking about training, but then turn that familiarity, practice-related familiarity, into their delivery. And so now we're going to put them head to head. And from my point of view, because we wanted to see what's the best route to get people to have more access to trainers, either one would have been a win, right? If both were found to be beneficial in training soldiers, that would have been great. But what ended up happening is that it was only these novice trainers that had a lot of context familiarity. They were the only ones that could successfully train, meaning their training benefited soldiers' ability to pay attention and their working memory. The other trainer, who had a lot of mindfulness expertise and no military familiarity, actually, it was as if they got no training at all.
Wow. That's really,
it was kind of a shocking finding. So, but I think it's important to keep those things in mind, is that you need direct experience as a trainer, and you need to have context familiarity, probably, to have the biggest benefit for the community you want to work with.
Yeah, that's crucial in our mindfulness community, because mindfulness-based stress reduction is a very rigorous training, right? And then this other piece to understanding that, well, it's rigor, but it's also context, and they can kind of compete with each other. It's very interesting to note for those of us that do this work. I want to come to a question that only surfaced at 3:40, 40 minutes into our webinar, which we probably should have had in the beginning. It comes from Pablo Del Real, which is, what is the definition of mindfulness? What's your definition of mindfulness? So maybe we just set the baseline there and then we can proceed.
Yeah, we just jumped right in without really talking through that. But I think it's a very good point. The kind of technical definition I'd give, which sounds a little academic-y, is mindfulness is a mental mode, so a way of making the mind, that has to do with paying attention to our present moment experience without conceptual elaboration or emotional reactivity. And so I just want to unpack those features. So I already talked about, being in the here and the now. So having that flashlight to this present moment. The conceptual elaboration that we're talking about is really judgment, bias, a story, editorializing about the moment. So mindfulness has to do with taking a quality of attention that doesn't have that. And then also not having emotional reactivity, so that you're kind of spinning off on what this moment means instead of directly experiencing it. So those I think, capture the key features of what we're seeing is important when people are getting trained for mindfulness.
Great, thank you. And then we have another question that relates a little bit more to the lasting effects of mindfulness of these types of mental training from one of our certified teachers, Laura Wells, who asks about the actual brain changes and the evidence from different types or short bursts of mindfulness, a few minutes at a time versus long bursts. So what is the, we talk about neuroplasticity, the way the brain can change, and how does it change from your knowledge and research when we exercise these types of mental capacities such as mindfulness?
Yeah, a great question. So I think neuroplasticity is kind of a buzzword, right? But we've known about it forever. The first kind of category of things that we know about for neuroplasticity is if somebody got injured, their brain wasn't going to work the same way. And somehow in the recovery process, it could change the way it functions, which meant that the brain is capable of changing the way it functions. So going from sort of injury recovery to now taking people that are healthy and optimizing them is sort of part of the same trajectory that we want to promote. And that's been what we've been interested in. Most of the studies that have been done with regard to brain changes with mindfulness training, most of them have not been done in sort of these randomized controlled trials where people that have no experience go in, get a short training, and then we see what happens, right? Because I think that level is still now starting to happen. Most of the studies have been done with people that self-select to practice and have been practicing for many, many years. So, it could be hundreds or thousands of hours that they've decided to engage in. And what we look for when we look for changes that might differentiate their brains from brains of people that don't practice at all goes back to what I was saying we think we're training with mindfulness training. So again, from the attention researcher point of view, I see the brain training piece as touching on all three brain systems of attention. So better focus, better ability to notice, this management issue of the executive control, as well as kind of turning down the dial on our own mind wandering. And it ends up that each of those functions has a identified brain network that's activated. So we've got the dorsal attention system, the saliency network, the central executive, the default mode. These are all brain networks that are involved in these functions. And thankfully, that gives us a really solid set of hypotheses. We can go in and probe the brains of people that are practicing and see, what do these systems look like? And so far, again, we're just at the stage where we're probably in the hundreds of studies now, not thousands yet. But what we're seeing seems to suggest that we're on track, that these are the systems that are getting stronger. And stronger from that point of view means that their efficiency, in terms of their functional efficiency, looks better. Sometimes that could mean that the neurons that are involved in these systems are more densely packed or gyrified, as we call them. And that these aspects of how the brain changes may even get further strengthened the more people practice, which is pretty exciting.
And, we've seen a few questions pop up here about challenges around that. And in particular, let me key on a few questions that popped up from a number of participants around training executive functioning, the juggling capacity. And someone in particular noted here that it's very difficult, for example, because they experience ADHD. And what about that? What about how can we strengthen the executive capacity? And what are some of the sort of states or conditions that make that very difficult?
Yeah, and I think my biggest caveat to my comment is tied to the same caveat I made earlier, is that when people have certain challenges, certain brain states, certain conditions, even if they're clinical disorders like anxiety or depression or something like ADHD, the way in which the training can be offered should be quite different than it's done with somebody who doesn't have those preconditions, right? So same thing with developmentally appropriate training. You don't probably want to give a 3-year-old the same training you want to give a 35-year-old because their capacities are different. So the good news is there is a lot of growing support that mindfulness training can be beneficial for adults with ADD and actually adolescents with ADD and ADHD. But the key is that the way in which the training is offered is quite different. So whereas in a MBSR program, you might, from day one, your homework is 45 minutes of a stillness practice. That is not something you'd probably offer somebody with ADHD. When we were doing a project with adults with ADD, we started with 1 minute as the first week. We built up to something like 12 minutes by the end of 8 weeks of a stillness practice. We had a lot more movement-oriented practices that allowed for engagement of kind of multiple systems. And what we found is that when people actually, we were very interested in how the medication use might have changed as a function of getting this kind of training, because they reported that their attention felt better. They felt more in control. But when we asked about medication use, most people said that their stimulant medication use had not changed at all. But the big difference, which kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation, is that they were much more aware of where their attention was. And that with that capacity, even if they took their stimulant medication, in most cases, they wouldn't just squander that time playing video games, but they'd be aware of their tendency of mind to be sucked into activities that weren't helpful for them, to redirect back and accomplish something else. So that meta-awareness piece was also strengthened by as little as a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes a day for these individuals, which I thought was very, very exciting, but points to how it's not one size fits all for training.
Right. So the other question related to that, being a psychologist myself as well, is what we call the downward extension. Where and how does this apply to children? Can children be trained on mindfulness? What's the state of science on that?
I think that's also a very big and growing field. There's an entire area of research on mindfulness in the educational context. And what we're seeing is that when training programs are made to be developmentally appropriate for children of different age ranges, there seem to be beneficial effects. When it comes to the school climate overall, when you add in not just training the children in specific mindfulness programs, but the teachers and even the administrators, and the parents in many cases, the entire community starts being able to be sort of self-supportive with many aspects of it. But the results are actually growing and quite strong, that you can improve at least aspects of attention, as well as reduce stress and improve mood in children with these practices, done in a developmentally appropriate way.
Yeah. So just one or two more questions. What should we be on the lookout, like watch out, kind of red flag for? Like, are there ways that mindfulness is being misused? Are there like solutions that are really like snake oil, as they say, meaning kind of like, falsely kind of claiming things? Like what would you say, just a watch out? We're interested in exploring mindfulness for better health and thriving, and especially in these times. Are there any watch outs that you think the audience needs to know about?
Yeah, I would say one of the biggest watch outs is a false expectation regarding what the result will be if you engage in mindfulness practices. As I said, the intention or the kind of description of mindfulness is paying attention to present moment experience without a story about it. And that's the promise, that you will become, if you engage in these practices, more clearly being able to comprehend what this moment is. It's not a promise that you will be blissful and joyful. It's not trying to achieve a special state of relaxation or a special positive mood. And so anything that sort of is promising a particular orientation toward the experience that isn't about the plain reality of what it is probably a little suspect, I would say. And I think this is actually very important for this particular moment, because many times, and we all want to feel better. I mean, I'm saying there's nothing wrong with wanting to feel better. We all want that. It's just the journey to how to get there that is going to be sort of important to keep in mind. And as I started out saying at the outset, our attention and our working memory are so important for everything we do. And one very important thing that we need them for is to regulate our mood. They're actually actively involved in emotion regulation. I mean, and of course, emotional intelligence, but just the regulating of keeping us steady. Now, as that capacity, as attention declines over high stress intervals, we have less and less available to us to continue to regulate our mood. And it starts this sort of downward spiral of we don't feel good and we can't kind of get back to a level, and then we don't feel good and we sort of go down and down. So one approach that people have suggested is, well, why don't you do positivity training? Or why don't you do relaxation training to help the mind kind of feel better, right? Not in the mindfulness sphere, just in general in the world. And so we wanted to see what would happen there if we compared positivity training to mindfulness training. Both could be beneficial potentially. But what ended up happening is that, especially under high stress circumstances, the project that I'm talking about was a recently published paper from my lab, where it was soldiers during pre-deployment, and we compared positivity training, which aims to cultivate more positive mood, to mindfulness training, which is more about attention to what is occurring in the here and the now. And the positivity training actually degraded attention and working memory. It made it worse, comparable to doing nothing at all under high stress circumstances.
Wow.
whereas the mindfulness training actually kept people steady. And that was eye-opening for me, because that means some instructions to look on the bright side, to find the good, to really tax your attention system, to kind of reframe your experience, may actually be depleting it further and further. You know, and that instead, if you take a break, don't try any of that, just take a more accepting, lightened up stance towards the here and the now, you might actually be allowing the system to kind of catch back up to being level under high stress circumstances.
Yeah. And from one participant is just kind of making a comment around that there's many other perspectives and approaches to kind of training our attention or wellness generally. Are there other techniques besides mindfulness that we should be aware of? I know you've studied mindfulness quite a lot and attention, right? Are there other things that are worth considering?
Absolutely. And I would say, by the way, positivity training is probably great under normal circumstances. If we aren't in a depleted, overly stressed or chronically stressed state, it actually there's plenty of research that says it's a great thing to do. I'm specifically talking about its use during times like this, when there is sort of a sustained amount of pressure and stress-related degradation we may experience. So positivity training is certainly something to consider under other circumstances. Relaxation training, same thing, very beneficial. These are sort of active visualization techniques that we might engage in to improve our mood. And those also can be quite beneficial. We've actually found that they are beneficial for mood. And the more people practice them, the more their mood improves. They're just not beneficial for attention. So, you know, there's so many things that we can do. I mean, exercising, sleeping, there's so many ways. Cognitive training involving computer-based games shows some promise for some groups, so there's a bigger problem with that of generalizability. You don't get better much than getting better at the game. There's a whole world of things that people can try. I think the evidence is not that robust regarding probably brain games, but I think that there things like positivity and relaxation is certainly part of the mix. Just watch out for when you decide to implement those in your life.
And then just one last question and one resource for people. Why has mindfulness become so prominent? Actually, one of the participants, Michael DeLisi, is asking, what has led mindfulness to be such an important practice over the past few years?
No idea. I mean, I really would say I'm surprised at the amount of interest in this particular topic. My hope is that it's because we are starting to understand, because of brain imaging, that just like we know from a much longer history that the body can be exercised for better health, that the mind can be exercised for better health, and that we can actually see the brain changes. This is not literally just made up. It's in your head and your brain is changing. And that's a very enticing possibility that I could exercise my mind to feel better, and I could sustain my wellness through something I could do for as little as, a dozen minutes a day.
Right. It works, one of the participants says, and the other one says, your research, thank you for being pioneering, from one of our teachers, Jason Gant. So thank you for that. Last thing I would say is, are there any resources we could point people to learn more about your own work? Oh,
you're welcome to come visit our website. It's amishi.com. This has all my lab's research papers. You can learn more about that. And I do think it's important to stay up to date on what the research is showing. So many great questions were asked regarding the different aspects of the research. And we also have a mindfulness resource at the University of Miami called Mindfulness. So if you just go to mindfulness.miami.edu, you can learn about more of our work in that community to help really bring these practices and make them more accessible for people.
And we've recorded this session, so also if you want to do a playback, you will see it on our website, SIYLI.org. Dr. Amishi Jha is on our board of directors, so we're getting a lot of this good input and a lot of this great guidance on the science of mindfulness and emotional intelligence. So thank you so much, Amishi, for being with us today. Thank you to the participants for your engagement and your really thoughtful questions. And may these practices and this science and this kind of know-how continue to help us all thrive. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Jha, and onward we go. Onward.
Excellent.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.